Thanks to the organizers and for sticking it out over a marathon of a day for the last session. Lots of really interesting things that I hope we can tie into. So I'm presenting work on our ongoing work on the compositional consequences of performance pay in the education sector in Rwanda. This is work that is joint with Claire Lever at the University of Oxford, Peter Niels at East Anglia, and Owen Osher at the World Bank. And the starting point here, I think, aligns quite nicely with something in one of the EDI white papers, which is the kind of the basic observation that getting good people in and keeping good people into the public sector and motivating them once they're there is kind of one of the fundamental core challenges of building state capacity in lots of developing country settings. We're thinking about education. I think there's lots of evidence that these kinds of on the compositional margins, that these kinds of issues of how to get the right people are extremely important in the education sector. So we see, huge heterogeneity in teacher value added next door in Uganda, or in teachers' observable skills in the work on the service delivery indicators of Tessa Bold and co-authors. We know from the US context that these differences in teacher value added not only translated to learning outcomes, but maybe have some lifelong labor market outcomes. The extent to which that, I think, will translate to a developing country setting is an open question. But in any case, there's reason to believe that teacher quality is kind of an important and persistent characteristic. This is no less true in Rwanda, where there is a surplus of people produced by the teacher training colleges in any given year. So lots of people come out of the teacher training colleges, which are sort of like secondary schools of last resort if you've done really badly on the exams. And many of them, perhaps many of the best of them, do not go into the education sector and into primary education jobs, primary teaching jobs, which are relatively low paid jobs. So the question of how to get people there is really a policy relevant question in Rwanda. Not only how to get people there, but then how to keep people, especially in hard to staff kind of rural areas, is a central question. So we've done, prior to this study, we've helped the Rwanda Education Board to look at some of the administrative data matching teachers across rounds. We see high rates of teacher job separations across years, and about half of those job separations are teachers leaving the education workforce altogether. A measure of how hard it is to get people into the education sector and to fill jobs is that even in some of the more attractive districts in which to work, like the capital city, if a school loses a teacher in any given year, the chances that they can get a new one in by the next year, that happens in the administrative data less than half of the time. So churn is a problem here. So getting the right people in, attracting people in particular to kind of rural and hard to reach postings, and keeping them once they're there are all kind of central questions to this kind of talent, how to get talent in side of the equation, as well as kind of the related question of how you motivate people once they're there. With a few key exceptions, most of the body of this literature is sort of attributable to people sitting in the room, 2/3 of it at least, we don't know a lot about how contractual terms are relevant for bringing people into these kinds of state jobs. So we have some evidence that higher pay can help from Mexico, that career incentives can help from Zambia, and Erica's work suggests that kind of higher pay can be a bit of a double-edged sword amongst community health workers. None of these studies speak to the role of performance-based pay in particular, which we have lots of evidence on the kind of effort margin responses to of teachers, but we don't really know whether this does anything to bring in the right kind of people, at least not in a developing country setting. So that's kind of the core area that we're focusing on here. So specifically then, we want to ask the question of kind of whether performance-related pay can attract, motivate, and help to retain better teachers in this Rwandan primary education setting. And at the core of this is, and the starting point for this, is a recruitment experiment that offers teachers, potential teachers, randomizing at the labor market level, the offer of a 2-year performance-based contract that has a bonus, if you win it, of about 15% of your annual salary, going to about 20% of teachers. And we're kind of benchmarking that because that has pure income effects as well as a kind of piece which is tied to your performance. We compare that with the consequences of a fixed wage contract that offers a 3% top up to the standard salary for sure. So at the core of this is a performance-based contract that is sort of has this tournament scheme, 1 in 5 people will win, versus a fixed wage contract in which everybody gets a little bit. Okay. So we study the consequences of that for who applies, and then ultimately we trace the people who are placed into jobs into the schools where they go. We can look at the attributes of the people who get jobs and their value added as teachers on the job once they're there. In addition, there's a kind of second tier to the study here in which we re-randomize the schools into which people are placed to try to allow us to get at a kind of pure compositional effect. So we will observe teachers who are kind of coming in under different contractual conditions, but end up in schools that place them in the same conditions. I'll talk more about that in just a moment. And so this school level randomization will also allow us to get at the effort margin, not just for the recruits, but for the incumbent teachers who are already there of this performance contract. And finally, in the kind of longer term follow-up, or part of the long-term part of this project, we're looking at the retention consequences, not just for recruits, but for incumbents. So who sticks around in these places as a function of the contracts that are offered there. We were guided to talk a little bit about opportunities to speak to policy. So let me just mention then that this project started with some policy advice that we provided to the government's office to the president's office as a backgrounder into a national leadership retreat. And just recently, last week, in fact, a brief that we've written on kind of the scope of teacher management policies went to cabinet as a background paper. So we're kind of in an active conversation about policy, and this is an active area of policy reform in Rwanda. There's lots of concerns about this issue, and there's a contractual vehicle for thinking about this, which are the imihigo. These are performance contracts that until recently applied to everyone in the civil service except teachers, and now they're reinstating them for primary teachers and trying to think about how the design of those contracts and what they should look like. Okay, so as I mentioned, the sort of core of this design is a two-tiered randomized controlled trial. At the first level, this is a labor market intervention that advertises either pay-for-performance contracts or fixed-wage contracts to the application pools into which people can apply. And then once people are, and that covers about 60% of the government's hires into the 2016 school year. And then once people are placed in those schools, the schools are then re-randomized. I can talk about the mechanics of that for people who are interested, but schools are re-randomized so that we get this effectively kind of 2-by-2 design for the people who end up in schools who may either have applied under advertised pay for performance or applied under fixed wages and then find themselves actually working in advertised performance or fixed wage contracts. In terms of measurement then, what we're going to look at are the kind of applicant pools. So what are the attributes of the universe of people who apply to these jobs? After all, the attributes of who actually ends up in the schools are kind of filtered through the hiring rules, but a kind of more general phenomenon is who wants these jobs. And so we'll look at the characteristics of applicants. Once people are actually placed in the schools, then we interview them face-to-face, and we can see a lot more about the characteristics of these hires. So here we measured skill through a test that was designed by the same person who designed the teacher skills test for the service delivery indicators of the World Bank, and should be comparable there. Although it's linked to the Rwandan curriculum in particular. We measure the motivation of teachers through standard lab experiments and a public sector motivation instrument that links to the work in Mexico and other people's work as well. And we measure the aspects of the personality of people, including their aversion to risk through standard instruments, but also the Big Five, which I think Kate is going to talk about as well, and has been shown in Michael's and others' work to be sort of a feature of who responds to these kinds of contracts, and so might also be a feature of who wants these kinds of contracts, one might imagine. So we can see these attributes of people who get placed in the schools. Then we can see the learning that they induce, which ultimately you might say is kind of the core policy outcome here. What is the value added of a teacher recruited under pay for performance versus the value added of a teacher recruited under fixed wages? And finally, and as part of what the EDI funding has enabled us to look at, we'll look at retention, both for the recruits and in a much larger sample for the incumbent teachers in these schools. Okay. So then in terms of progress to date, so in January, the data collection was finished for this study. We've been working since then, because it's a labor market experiment and we had kind of ex-ante desires to maximize power, we've been working with a blinded data set that we've been using to kind of build a pre-analysis plan to think carefully about what are well-powered tests of the hypotheses in which we are interested. That is now just about done, and in fact our intention is to unblind ourselves within the next week or so. So now's a great time to tell us that we're doing wrong-headed things or forgetting to test really interesting hypotheses. And so we have kind of drafts of those, and then we hope to be actually sharing results, at least on the first set of questions on the recruitment margin quite soon, and on the retention margin not too long after that. So I think that's where I'll stop, and welcome your questions.
Compared to the paper in Mexico, so I know the setting is different. This is teachers, and you would be able to see outcomes like value added, which was harder to measure, I guess, in the other paper. Mm-hmm. So would you say the difference is this ability to measure outcomes better?
So I think there are two. There are a couple of differences. So one is that it's helpful that there are kind of standardized measures of outcomes available in the education sector. So it's pretty, we can follow a literature that tells us how to think about the quality of a teacher in a way that for the civil service more broadly is a harder and important question. So I think that makes our life easier than theirs might have been in some sense. Second is that the nature of the contract. So that study looks at unconditional increases in pay or unconditional variation in pay. Here we were talking about variation in pay, which has the same expected payout under all arms of the study, but in one case doesn't depend on anything that you do, it's just more money, and in another case is explicitly linked, and people are told it's going to be linked to their performance on the job. We did a pilot year and worked hard with the Ministry of Education to develop that measure. It includes half of the weight on test scores, and actually, as is kind of common and recommended by the big Gates study on this stuff for the US, it's a hybrid measure that includes some direct classroom observation and teacher presence and other things. So it's a big kind of hybrid contract that is intended as a meaningful and salient measure of your performance on the job. So I think that's a second important difference. And then the third difference is that is in this re-randomization. So to the extent that studies want to trace out what are the consequences of pay for performance on the recruitment margin, it's often very hard, in many settings it's very hard to say what is the compositional effect of that, because you offer someone a contract and then you see them under that contractual condition, and so you observe both the compositional effect but also the effort response that induces after the fact. The fact that we re-randomize teachers into these contracts means that we can observe teachers holding constant their actual contractual status, but looking at the pure compositional differences, in some sense a pure compositional difference, which is important if you want to look at kind of down the line consequences for performance.
Haven't you learned here that the high performers, the best guys who apply under the bid for performance and are disappointed by the fixed wage, in a sense it's a drop of payment, this could reduce their retention and vice versa?
Sure. Yeah, so I think you would be worried about that, and of course people may be over optimistic, so most people think they're going to win these kinds of things. So the way that we dealt with this in the experimental design is that when we announce the re-randomization, we effectively buy out people's prior expectations for what they could have won. So for recruits who are new to the schools, we offer a retention bonus, and in any case you would have had to stay until the end of the year to get paid, so that doesn't meaningfully change incentives in that sense. We offer a retention bonus across the board that makes up the differential. So the fixed wage was $20,000. We offer a retention bonus of $80,000, which takes your fixed wage payment to the most you could have expected if you thought you were going to win the performance contract for sure, which is 100,000 Rwandan francs. So in essence, we use this retention bonus to ensure that no matter what you thought you were going to get, you do at least as well under the re-randomized contracts for the recruits in particular. And that, both in terms of avoiding disappointment, but also from an ethical perspective, was important. So nobody gets less than they could conceivably have thought they were going to get, even after the re-randomization. Yeah.
If I understand the experiment correctly, then at least part of what you're testing is to what extent retention of teachers enhances learning outcomes. And I think one of the great things about EDI is, and this initiative in particular, is that we also have Fred Nunn, who's doing a project in Uganda where actually we're rotating teachers around. And so I wonder, is there an explicit test? What extent the retention, longer retention of teachers enhances of education?
So we'd love to talk more about the details of that. I would say that it's probably generically true that the consequences of teacher retention depend on who you're keeping. And so we are interested both in, are teachers more likely on average to stick around under a performance contract than under a fixed wage contract? But we're also interested in particular in the question of whether one type of, let's say, a performance contract improves the profile of the teachers you retain. So in Washington, D.C., for example, teachers who perform badly exit the system after the introduction of teacher performance-related pay. And to the extent that one of the challenges here is you have many developing, let me not say for Rwanda in particular, but many developing countries have a large stock of relatively low-skilled teachers. Churn can be your friend if it's the right people leaving.
A couple of questions. One, what is the role of schools in selecting the teachers, right? Because you can observe applications, and then there's the role of schools. And the second one, and I'm curious about how you're thinking about what you learn from these, right? Because if the outside option of these guys, I mean, if these guys are going to be teachers in the public sector, no matter what, basically you're making smart people go towards some schools, and that means that two people are not going to. So you're basically affecting both the treatment and the control. Right?
Sure.
And, so how do you characterize their outside options and how?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, both good questions, and so I'll just offer quick responses, and then I'm happy to talk more. So hiring here is done entirely at the district level. So those personnel decisions are made centrally, and the teachers are assigned to schools once they accept a contract. So the school plays no role in whom they get. The only thing a school does is state its needs, and so our study covers all teachers who are placed into upper primary positions. That's grades 4, 5, and 6. Some people might have been hired, but schools may not have needed upper primary teachers. They might have needed a first grade teacher, and so that wouldn't be in the domain covered by our study, and we would not have enrolled that school as a consequence. But the assignment is essentially, the hiring process and the assignment is essentially at the district level. I think that it's, on your second point, I think it's true and important that sometimes this is a kind of redistribution question. In some contexts, this will be a redistribution question about how do you get people to move from the best people trying to get the nice cushy jobs in the capital to some good people trying to move into the rural areas. In this particular context, it looks to us, and we have some data to back this up, including data from a job fair where people that sort of solicited the participation of some of potential applicants before they actually apply. We think that a lot of people, and we've got a little bit more data collection to do on exactly this, we think that a lot of people are actually just not becoming teachers at all. Right? So one thing that is true for sure is that there are many more graduates of teacher training colleges than there are teaching positions available in any given year, new teaching lines. And so that's not true everywhere. In countries like Kenya, there are big queues for teaching jobs. That's not the case, at least for these districts. And so we think that we are mostly pulling people out of private sector alternatives rather than out of teaching jobs elsewhere. But in other settings, if that were your concern, you might think then that this is, you think of this as a policy device that you would use as hardship pay to pull people into, out of one place and into another. I think that's not the right way to think about this particular setting, but I think that would be the case in other settings, or could be the case in other settings.